Chega, Portugal's so-called far-right party, is facing a 10-year restriction on its Facebook account. Chega's significant rise in parliamentary representation during the recent elections has said to be one of the reasons, but Meta cited violations of community standards.
I'm here with Miguel Nunes Silva, director of the Trezeno Institute and local councilman. Welcome to Riks Europe.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me again.
So could you provide more insight into Metaplatforms wanting to restrict Chega's Facebook account?
Sure. So this is not the first time that it happens. This happened to be particularly vicious this time. It happened to the party's main Facebook page. And it's important to understand that much of the communication that the party holds with its supporters in Portugal is done through social media, and in particular through Facebook. Because for a long time, right-wing forces, and Chega in particular, were pretty much barred from mainstream television or mainstream newspapers. So the main channel of communication is social media, and within social media, particularly Facebook, because it appeals to an older demographic, which is, of course, the main base of support of Chega. Now, there had been previous blocks and suspensions and censorship, basically, to individual pages of Chega politicians, including mine. I remember, for example, that during the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, I was one of those that Twitter censored. But in Portugal as well, motivated by a variety of different issues. But until now, most of these suspensions or censorship in general had addressed particular pages. And this time it was the party page. And the party's page is one of the biggest ones, not quite as big as the leaders. And André Ventura's page has hundreds of thousands of followers, far ahead of any other political leader. But what he had done, his own page had some restrictions. So what he had done was he had resorted to sharing the posts that Chega's main page did. And now, of course, even that would become impossible. Now, thankfully, as I just communicated to you, this morning Facebook reversed its decision. So it is possible that this was an individual content reviewer that decided to restrict the page. It was not necessarily Facebook's overall policy. But this is something that happens constantly, and of course, in particular to right-wing forces, and specifically targeting Chega.
And you said it's been lifted now, but it was to my understanding that Chega had made a decision to take legal action against Metaplatforms. What were they hoping to achieve then, apart from it being lifted, of course?
I believe they had decided to sue Meta in court. I believe also because, again, this was not the first time that it happened. What they hoped to achieve was to basically reinstate all the regular freedoms that a page has. I don't think that this was a class action civil suit that would seek to completely change laws. But I also think that the motivation and the justification for the suit was not this one particular decision, but a whole string of different decisions that have throughout the years contributed to censoring, again, specifically Chega politicians and supporters.
What do you believe are the implications of Meta's decision to stop Chega's ability to engage with their audience and their voters? They mention a violation of community standards, but also the numbers in the recent elections pose an idea of a possible power shift. Is this part of the reason, do you believe, that Meta did this?
Well, that is a good question for Meta themselves. You would have to ask them. If I'm allowed to speculate, I would say I actually expected something like this. We in the party expected something like this prior to the national elections that we had just this past March. It didn't happen. What usually happens in Portugal, or at least it has happened the past 4 years, is that prior to the national elections, the mainstream television channels will release some kind of documentary trying to associate Chega with extremist, underground, right-wing radical forces or something of that nature. That didn't happen quite as much this time. But I guess for Facebook, and again, I'm merely speculating, perhaps for Facebook, the biggest triggers were, on one hand, Chega's very good results in the national elections, but on the other, the upcoming European elections. If they were able to keep Chega restricted on social media up until June, then perhaps that would have some influence on the results of the European elections, especially because at this point, Chega is practically tied with the ruling party, the Social Democratic, allegedly center-right party. They're both at around 20%. And there's a real possibility that Chega would be able to have either the same number of MEPs or even one more MEP than the ruling party, which would be, of course, a big humiliation for the mainstream parties in general. But again, this is merely a supposition.
There's been accusations of discriminatory speech against Chega in the past. How has the party responded to these allegations, and how might they relate to these restrictions imposed by the Metaplatforms?
So we have to distinguish between two different things. It is okay to have inflammatory statements and discrimination, so long as you do it with left-wing talking points and ideals and values. If you do it with right-wing or conservative ones, then that becomes a problem. So specifically in this case, you might know that Facebook almost rarely informs its users on why they enact restrictions. Sometimes they can identify the particular posts that triggered the restriction, but they never provide a justification. And it was the same thing with Chega this time. They didn't justify why. We suspect that this came about because the party page made a post complaining about or I think denouncing yet another case of that was related to the Gypsy community. So namely, there had been one Gypsy minor who had been pulled from public school by her family in order to, I suppose, get married at a very young age. And so Chega denounced this case. And it was not that the case, again, we heard about it from media in general, from the mainstream media. I think that what motivates Facebook's decision is the fact that Chega will persistently denounce cases related to the Gypsy community. Now, in mainstream thought, in mainstream politics, it's okay to discriminate the Gypsy community, so long as you're doing it for good reasons. So, for example, the Gypsy community has unusual levels of poverty or unusual levels of people incarcerated. That's okay to discriminate. But if you decide to point out that the Gypsy community is also particularly of ill repute in other matters, so if the discrimination is negative rather than positive, if instead of victimizing it demonizes, then that would not be acceptable. And we believe, or I can speculate, that for Facebook, it was not so much the news of this case that was a problem. It was the fact that Chega will systematically denounce these cases in public and give them public exposure. Now, in terms of the discrimination, again, it's okay if any political party or pundit speaks ill of politicians or parties or even communities, so long as it's done in a non-discriminatory way. The problem with Chega and conservatives is that they will tell you, listen, there are specific problems in law enforcement or in social problems with this particular community. And that's, I think, where Facebook would allege that its community standards are violated.
So what strategies might Chega use in the future to be able to continue to bring forth their messages and speak their mind and have an online presence without these restrictions or possibility of being restricted?
That's a good question. I mean, we have more or less our hands tied because we do really rely a great deal on social media. Now, the party has attempted to propagate its efforts and its exposure. So we have channels on YouTube and on TikTok and on Instagram. So we don't depend exclusively on Facebook. But it is problematic because it is on Facebook that the most interaction with our supporters happens. So, for example, I'm a councilman, and the best way that I have to communicate with people from my municipality is through Facebook. It wouldn't be through Instagram or TikTok. The party has also invested in a number of different ways of trying to mitigate its dependence on social media. One is we have started printing our own newspaper and distributing it for free. It has a small number of issues, but a small number of copies. But we are expanding, and at least it's becoming well known. Our own website on the internet, and we have also developed our own social media platform, if you will. So if you, for example, if you sign up to become a supporter of Chega with a paying subscription to the party, then you get automatic access to sort of a type of internal Facebook of the party, where people can share and share likes and share articles and share opinions. Again, these are not nowhere near as effective as Facebook, but it's what we can do. And again, the problem, I think, is that Chega has an overwhelming presence on social media. So some of the biggest political YouTube channels in Portugal are from Chega supporters, and some of the biggest political pages in Portugal are from Chega leaders. So the rest of the mainstream see that as a big threat, because these are avenues, these are means of communication that they cannot control. They can control TV, they can control newspapers, but they cannot really control social media.
And how can this coexist with freedom of speech? This sort of cancel culture, so to speak, where you as a party are being restricted.
It cannot, I would say the social media is a particular weakness of Chega, because we rely incredibly on social media. But this is not the only form of, say, censorship or discrimination that we face. So, for example, all the main TV channels have political pundits. Those political pundits are meant to be somewhat independent in their opinions, but they usually pick 3 or 4 to represent the main parties. And even though Chega has been the third largest party for a number of years now, there are no Chega-affiliated pundits on TV. There are no Chega-affiliated columnists in the newspapers. So it is an overall overwhelming barrage against not just Chega, but mainly Chega politicians and opinion makers.
Thank you, Miguel Nunes Silva, Director of the Trezeno Institute and local councilman.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.